special guest this evening is Robert Guffey. And Robert Guffey is a lecturer in the Department of English at California State University, Long Beach. His latest book is Chameleo, a strange but true story of invisible spies, heroin addiction, and Homeland Security. And that's Or Books 2015, which Flavorwire has called, quote, by many miles the weirdest and funniest book of 2015, unquote. A graduate of the famed Clarion Writers Workshop in Seattle, he has also written a collection of novellas entitled Spies Saucers, PS Publishing of 2014. His first book of nonfiction, Crypto-scatology, Conspiracy Theory as Art Form, was published in 2012. He's written stories and articles for numerous magazines and anthologies, among them Fortean Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Mailer Review Mysteries, New Dawn, the New York Review of Science Fiction, Paranoia, Postscripts, and Video Watchdog Magazine. And his website is Crypto-scatology.com. I put the links in the chat for his books, Chameleo, A Strange But True Story of Invisible Spies, Heroin Addiction, and Homeland Security. And it is with great pleasure we honor and welcome Robert to the show this evening. Hello there.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for joining us. I'm excited to discuss your book tonight. It's going to be very interesting for sure. And so let's just get right into it. Let's talk about, first of all, let's talk about how you got involved in writing this book. It seems like it has a very long scenario, and of course your friend who got involved in all of this stuff. So wherever you want to start, I'm going to let you roll with how you got involved with this.
Okay, it's certainly not a book I ever intended to write or thought I would write. It just sort of fell into my lap because it involves a friend of mine, a guy I've known since I was 16. In fact, I met him on my 16th birthday. And in the book, I call him Dion Fuller, but he told me he doesn't mind if I use his real name. His real name's Damien. And it all started on July 12th, 2003. I remember that was the specific day because it was also the day that I was initiated into the third degree of Freemasonry in my Blue Lodge in Torrance. And I mention that because it plays an important part in the story later on. But that was the day where I had called Damien to tell him, that I had successfully gone through the third degree, but he wasn't home. And I didn't hear from him for a whole week, which was unusual. After a week had gone by, he finally calls me and he tells me this incredible story, which was that a week earlier, he lived in the Pacific Beach area of San Diego. He was heavily into drugs, and so his house in Pacific Beach was kind of a party house, and people would come in and out all the time. Well, there's this one guy named, his name was either Lee or Doyle. He said his name was Lee, but later on the authorities told Damien that his actual name was Doyle, so we don't know his real name. But he was a kid, his early 20s. He had gone AWOL from Camp Pendleton, and which is a military base that's right nearby Pacific Beach, San Diego. And when he went AWOL, he took with him a 9mm Iraqi gun, which he stole from the base, along with 23 pairs of high-tech night vision goggles, a DoD laptop computer, and a truck. How he could take all of these things off the base is beyond me, but I suspect it's actually easier than one might imagine. There was a case in the 90s of a guy who actually stole a whole tank off of a military base, and you can probably find this on YouTube. If you just search for like San Diego guy with tank, you'll find the footage of this guy just running this tank right down the middle of the street in San Diego.
Oh, that's funny.
And in fact, there's a documentary about that guy that I mentioned in Chameleo, because when you look deeper into that case, it turns out that guy was reporting gang stalking activity as well. He was fed up and he stole the tank to drive it to City Hall to get people to pay attention to what he was doing.
Interesting.
Well, they pulled him out of the tank and shot him, so it didn't quite work out the way he wanted. Perhaps not the wisest choice.
Mm-hmm.
So some people have read this and said, how could this guy steal all these things from a military base? Well, this guy stole a whole tank, so what I'm saying isn't actually all that unbelievable. Mm-hmm. So he took all this stuff, and some of it he brought with him to Damien's house. Now, Damien had just met the guy, and he let all kinds of people sleep there on the floor, crash, whatever. So this guy had only been there for about 2 days maybe, and one night they're partying. This kid, Lee, he opens up the laptop, and that's when the DOD symbol appeared on the screen. And Damien saw that and said, okay, get your stuff and get out of here. And the kid's like, no, don't worry about it. They can't track this stuff. Minutes later, there's this knock at the door. Damien opens it. It's a woman who identified herself as Lisa Johnson. That's a made-up name of the NCIS, and she's there with two other goons. And she says, we're going to search the place. Well, Damien's father was a narcotics cop, so he's well aware of one's rights in these situations. And so Damien said, do you have a warrant? She said, I can get a warrant. And he said, go get a warrant. Closed the door in her face. He turned to all the people at the party and said, get your stuff and get out of here, meaning pick up your drugs and get out, go out the back. Everyone takes their drugs and throws them on his floor, and then they go out the back. Minutes later, the cops show up, seemingly separate from the NCIS. The NCIS comes back with the warrant. They raid the place. They arrest Lee. They confiscate the DOD laptop computer, on which, by the way, was an odd field journal. It appeared to be some sort of field journal that had been written about exotic technology being used in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. At least just from what Damien, the brief, glimpses he got out of it. The NCIS and the police, they come in, they arrest Damien, they arrest Lee. They take them down to the jail downtown San Diego. They give Damien the Abu Ghraib treatment for about 7 days. They're interrogating him. They insist that Damien must have been planning to sell this equipment, particularly the night vision goggles, to like Al-Qaeda or some sort of foreign terrorist. Damien saying, whoa, no, I didn't even know that this guy had this stuff until 2 seconds ago. They don't believe that. It turns into this whole Kafkaesque nightmare. They want Damien to snitch, essentially, on the other guy, on Lee. Mm-hmm. And Damien, having been out of jail his whole life, was not willing to snitch on Lee, particularly since he didn't know him and didn't really know anything about the situation anyway. So that annoyed them. But eventually, after about a week, they let Damien go. So he goes home and he calls me and tells me this story, and I'm, flabbergasted. But then it gets stranger because I assumed, and Damien assumed, that obviously they'd realized that Damien knew nothing about the situation, decided to let him go and concentrate on more important things. Apparently not, because then from that point on, Damien's being followed all around Pacific Beach, all around San Diego, just ridiculous, parades of people following him in. He goes into a 7-Eleven on Garnet Avenue, and about 7 jarheads follow him in and follow him back out again. Goes to a local restaurant. There's people. What I now know is they're sort of mobbing him, doing street theater kind of stuff. But I had never heard of any of this at the time. This is again July of 2003. Mm-hmm. And Damien never heard of any of this type of thing. I was well familiar with mind control, MK Ultra, that kind of stuff, because I'd been friends with Walter Board, who wrote Operation Mind Control, which was sort of like the first book to explore MK Ultra and the survivors of these mind control programs going all the way back to the 50s and even earlier. So I was well aware of that having gone on, but this aspect of it, this peculiar kind of gang stalking, and that word didn't even exist in 2003. Mm-hmm. This was completely foreign to me, and my first reaction when Damien told me that he was being followed, shadowed by innumerable people all around San Diego was, I thought, maybe he's suffering from some sort of drug-related paranoia. So I asked him, well, take photographs of the license plates of the cars that are parked outside your house. He claimed that there were these cars parked outside, constantly shining lights through his windows, people doing weird hand signals at him while he's walking down the street, people talking about him while he's on the bus, the people behind him talking about him, and saying negative things. he claimed that at one point a guy follows him into a Salvation Army, I believe it was, and Damien leads him into the AM/PM across the street. Damien gets this 32-ounce slushy, comes back out and throws the slushy in the guy's face. This big Marine-looking guy, like a buzz cut, throws the entire slushy in his face in the middle of the street. Then Damien calls him a faggot, which would normally make a true blood, red-blooded military jarhead react in anger. He didn't do anything. He just stared at him as if, with slushy coming down his face. So these kinds of things were happening. And so I told Damien, okay, this is really happening, document it. Mm-hmm. Photograph the license plates, photograph the people, whatever you can do. So he sends me, he does that, and he sends me these photographs of all these license plates. I write down all the license plate numbers, and I sent them to a friend of mine up in Washington, Seattle, Washington. And he knew a guy who worked at the DMV. So the guy at the DMV ran all the numbers, and all of them came back as being non-existent, even though I knew they existed because he had photographed them. And it seemed to me the only reason that would be the case is if they were government vehicles. Even if Damien had made up the license plate numbers off the top of his head, you think he would just by chance hit it on an actual vehicle, or if he was being paranoid and these were just normal people who lived next door or whatever, were parked in the neighborhood, again, the vehicles would come up as being real vehicles.
Right. And can I ask you real quick what kind of vehicles they were? I mean, were they SUVs, or did they have a particular model or make?
I include that information in the book. It's like within the first 50 pages. I don't remember off the top of my head now exactly, but that information is in the first few chapters. So including license plate numbers are in there. So anyway, if anyone else wants to run them, they can. So that was the first indication that, okay, this is not some sort of meth-induced paranoia or something. There's some reality to this. And from there on, it got even stranger, where they were sort of bombarding him with hallucinations, holograms. And it was around this time that I realized that the place where he lived, he was surrounded by corporations like SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, and ATC, American Technology Corporation, which has since changed its name, which are these military corporations that build exotic weapons for the military. Literally, these corporations were like within 10 minutes of Damien's apartment. And strange things would happen where he would wake up and he'd look out the window, and outside his window would be this alien landscape, classic, like three moons in the sky, like a Boris Vallejo painting. And then he'd open the door, and of course it was the normal scenery that he would normally see. Close the door and look out the window, there's the weird alien landscape. People would come over and ask Damien if the apartment had gotten smaller. It would seem as if occasionally as if the entire room had shrunk. And other people would comment on this. It wasn't just Damien. Or they could do the opposite, make it seem much larger inside, like Doctor Who's TARDIS. You'd go inside and the room seemed much bigger. And then the strangest thing was that he started to encounter people in his house who he could not see. They would push him over. They would interact with him. They were, for the most part, camouflaged, except that occasionally he would be able to see these little dots in the air, almost like what you see if you suffer from an intense migraine headache, these auras. Occasionally he would see a kind of aura-like outline of a human figure. And one time he was in the bathroom, and as he was opening the mirror on the medicine cabinet, as the mirror was in motion, he was able to see these people behind him. And all that sort of fascinated me because Damien didn't have any sort of technological background, and neither do I really, but there was something about these odd details that seemed real to me. It didn't seem like something you would hallucinate, the idea that you could see it in the mirror, but not in the mirror, but not while staring at it face to face. These things seemed like believable details. Also, they would project like a shadow on the wall above his bed of a hand holding a gun, and then the hand would tip down with the gun pointing at his head, and they would do this like over and over again.
So it sounds like they went to great lengths to really give this guy a hard time. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to interject there for a second. And all this was for what? The goggles?
Yes. As the story unfolded, we were trying to figure out what this was all about. And one day, the woman I mentioned earlier, who in the book I call Lita Johnson, the head of this investigation for the NCIS, she showed up at his door with two more goons in tow, and said, after this had been going on a couple of weeks, she shows up at the door. Have you changed your mind? You want to cooperate now? You want to tell us more about where these goggles are? That was the thing they were most interested in. I mean, when the police came in, there were drugs all over the floor. They didn't care about that.
Mm-hmm.
They let them go.
What kind of drugs were over there?
Well, I mean, as in the subtitle, it's a strange but true story of an invisible spy, heroin addiction and Homeland Security. So Damien's drug of choice was heroin, and which is not a hallucinogen, by the way, if in case anyone does not know that, because some people will hear the story and say, well, this guy was a drug addict. How do you know he wasn't hallucinating it? Heroin's not a hallucinogen. But that was his drug of choice. Mm-hmm. So this woman from the NCIS shows up, and she's saying things like, "Are you ready to cooperate now?" And she gave him her card and said, "Call me when you're ready to cooperate." And then she left, and then the second she left, it all started up again. And to the point where there were surreal things. He woke up one night and there was a kind of black amorphous energy that kind of crawled across the floor, entered his leather jacket, and then the leather jacket proceeded to crawl across the floor. I mean, this was really bizarre stuff, Mm-hmm. Now, in case anyone's wondering if this woman was some sort of hallucination, she gave him her card. So I said, give me the number. I actually called her on the phone, and I had a conversation with her. And it was a peculiar conversation because I called her and said, my friend thinks he's being followed. And then she proceeded to give me a lot of CYA, cover your ass kind of bureaucratic language, which I was just listening to the Republican debates, and you heard a lot of it there too, particularly from Ted Cruz, and she would say, "Well, no one in my agency is currently following your friend." Things like that. And instead of just saying no, she would go out of her way to phrase it very carefully, in a Bill Clinton kind of manner, Mm-hmm. And that was suspicious. And then she tried to convince me that he was crazy. And so the phone conversation didn't go well. But I did speak to her, and she acted very strange during the entire conversation. So it got to the point where it became more and more threatening. One night I was on the phone with him all night as they were sending these acoustic bullets into his apartment. Invisible, bullets made of sound coming through the wall and shattering everything around him. And I could hear the thing shattering, falling off the shelf. And Damien, who's been in and out of jail, homeless, he's well acquainted with life-threatening situations. Mm-hmm. I never really heard him afraid, but I heard him afraid that night because essentially it was like poltergeist activity. I mean, that's essentially what you would think it was if you had no knowledge of what was happening. You would think there were ghosts, literally things flying off the shelves and shattering. Mm-hmm. And I heard all that stuff happening as I was talking to him on the phone, and I kind of had to talk him down. I mean, during this entire experience when he was in San Diego, which lasted from July of 2003 all the way to about January or February of 2004, I was in constant communication with him and writing all of this stuff down. And trying to get some help, scouring the internet trying to figure out what this stuff was, I came across an article by Raven 1, which was the only place I found anything that even seemed to vaguely describe what was happening. It was a little article called All About Street Theater on raven1.net, which is no longer there. But this little article, All About Street Theater, seemed to perfectly describe everything that he was experiencing. And so during this whole time period, it got to the point where he was losing weight. He was urinating blood, a metallic taste in his mouth. At one point, he had this waking dream. It wasn't a dream, but that's how he described it. And he was on his couch in his apartment, and these people came in, and he remembered trying to hold his arms across his chest, and they peeled his arms back, and then they injected him with something. And it's the only time, and he described this to me with great fear in his voice. He was very disturbed by this, because he remembered it only as if it had occurred in some sort of twilight sleep state. And it was the only time I've ever heard Damien associate a needle with fear, because he's a heroin addict, so he doesn't, I've seen him shoot up on the bus. He doesn't react to a needle in the same way that normal people do. But in this case, he was very frightened about what it was they had done to him. And that was very disturbing. So it just so happened that around that time, which I believe was around January of 2004, Damien ran into a guy at the beach who was trying to get this beachcomber who was trying to get rid of a van that he had, and he wanted $500 for it. I think it was $500 and maybe a little bit more. And without telling Damien that I was going to do this, I pulled out some money from my bank account. I went down to Western Union to send it to him via Western Union. Now, when you do that, you have to have the other party has to have a code word in order to get it, to prove that you're the party that's supposed to receive it. So I called him to tell him the password, and Damien made the mistake of saying, no, don't give it to me now, because I'm not going to go there yet. Give it to me when I call back. So he calls back, and every time I tried to give him the password, the phone would cut out. I'd get out one syllable, the phone would cut out. Then I'd call back, and then it would be busy. Or I'd call back, and I'd try to tell him again, the phone would cut out. And this would happen consistently. It happened 7 times in a row. Fortunately, I was able to give him the password with a hint that I actually can't say on the air, but it's in the book because it's rather pornographic. But it was something he would know, but no one else would. And so I was able to make a collect call. And if you've ever made a collect call, there's a brief moment when the operator's on the line and the other person can hear you while the operator is asking the other person to accept the charges. So during that brief moment, I yelled out the hint for the password, and then he was able to go and get the money out of Western Union, before they cut off the line again. So he went and pulled the money out and bought this van, and basically just threw all of his stuff into the van, which his landlord seemed very pleased that he was leaving. His landlord was just as stressed as he was. All of Damien's neighbors had moved out and had been replaced by new people. And these new people were openly hostile, and which seems to be part of the pattern.
Right. Were they like plants, do you think, or?
Well, I think so. I was interviewed by Tessa Dick, who was the widow of Philip K. Dick, who wrote Valis.
Wow.
And,
awesome.
And she wrote a memoir. She read the book, and she loved it. And it was amazing how many parallels there were between her memoir and this book, because a lot of the stuff Phil Dick went through in the 70s was almost exactly the same.
He certainly did, yeah.
weird neighbors moving in, bringing in technology into the house, voices in the head, the radio talking and saying negative things to him, even though the radio was not plugged into the wall. These were things that both Tessa Dick and Phil Dick heard, at the same time. So apparently these techniques go back at least as far back as the 70s.
Oh yeah, even before that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And if anyone's ever read Phil Dick's Valis, that's a good book to read because it seems to touch on these areas in a fictional format.
Right.
So getting back to the ban, Damien basically put all the stuff in the ban and just left, assuming that if he left the area, it would end. And a lot of people think that. In fact, I recently got visited by a guy who was a lawyer in Minnesota, and he had his own law firm, $1 million house beside the lake, member of the country club. He had to leave Minnesota with a suitcase and came all the way to Long Beach just to meet me and talk to me because he'd heard a previous interview with me and thought that for him this was the first time he'd heard anything that even vaguely described what he'd been going through for about 5 years. And he came all the way to Long Beach to talk to me about it. But he did the same thing. He fled Minnesota and came to the West Coast thinking it'll end if I leave the area. And it never does end. I got a call from a guy in Thailand who had been living in Florida, and he'd been having an affair with the wife of the local sheriff. And apparently you don't do that in a small town in Florida because that initiated all this for this guy. He fled all the way to Thailand, and that didn't stop it either.
No.
Another guy, as a journalist in Australia, called me. He fled the United States, went up to Australia. It still continued even in Australia.
Yeah, it's satellite-driven technology. That's why. But
Right.
that's a long story. But very interesting, and I'll tell you, because of my background, I can correlate a lot of your case. And I know a lot of people who are targeted, gaslighted, gang-stalked. You name it, they've done it. Yes. So, yeah.
But by the way, the one thing, my main function during all of this was essentially to talk to Damien on the phone and to try to keep it light. I mean,
right.
we would make up jokes about it, about the invisible people. We called them invisible midgets, and just figured out ways to flip the script on them. I mean, there was one amusing moment where Damien was in the kitchen, and there were two of these guys outside, two of these jarheads outside, just right outside his kitchen. So Damien just went about his business, and he started making lunch, and he grabbed like some ravioli sauce and some Jell-O and some peanut butter and some baking soda and put it all in a bowl and like stirred it up, and then he ran outside and then dumped the bowl over the fence, and it hit these two jarheads on the head. Normally, you would think they would get pissed off and say, "Why did you do that?" They just ran away off into the Vons parking lot, He was constantly doing things to annoy them. And I should tell you about the encounter at the bagel shop. At one point, he came up with a brilliant idea that he said, "You know what if I try to work for them? Like, what if I try to get the night vision goggles back?" He had heard that maybe some of these goggles had been might have ended up in the hands of the local Hells Angels to be used to smuggle drugs in over the border, the Mexican border. And he said, like, what if I offered to like work for them? Like, maybe if I do that, maybe this will all stop. And I said to him, that's not going to work. They're just going to think that you knew where they were all along, and now like you want money for it, Well, he didn't take my advice. So he met with Lita Johnson and her immediate superior at this bagel shop on Garnet Avenue and proposed this. And instead of them saying, "Oh yes, come work for us," the guy, her Lita Johnson superior, just like smashed his hand into the table and his face got red, and he said, "You're going to give us this stuff back." And Lita Johnson went off on some tangent about how their whole purpose was to clean up the area, how she had grown up in this neighborhood in Pacific Beach, and it had been taken over by drug addicts and immoral people, and that their purpose was to stop all of this. And the wonderful thing about Damien is that he sometimes has a kind of Candide-like quality about his personality where he's being insulted but doesn't know it. Mm-hmm. So she's talking about all these, quote, drug addicts and scumbags littering her neighborhood of Pacific Beach, and he doesn't realize that she's talking about him. Mm-hmm. So he immediately agrees with her and says, "Oh yes, I know. I can't stand all these scumbags here. I would love to help you get rid of those people." Yeah, and this was just making them more and more frustrated. And so finally, at a certain point, when Damien realized that this wasn't going well, he just said to Lita Superior, "Oh, okay. Listen, obviously, I don't have a need to know." He started insulting this guy, basically saying that he was just a bureaucrat who was, a voyeur, who was a perverse voyeur who was just spying on people, and that really pissed the guy off, and so that meeting didn't go well. But to this day, Damien thinks that encounter, that the guy was so pissed off that that didn't help the situation at all. It just made it worse. But going forward, when he left the San Diego in the van, he immediately starts getting followed by these little drones, these little UFO-like drones, And again, this is like the beginning of 2004. No one's talking about drones. Mm-hmm. Drones aren't getting shot out of the sky by people as they are today.
Right.
These little things follow him. He drives all the way to Texas, goes from Texas through all the way to Minnesota. At one point, he goes into a bathroom in Minnesota, and he's washing his hands, and a guy he's never seen before comes in, is washing the hands in the sink next to him, and the guy says to Damien, "If you just give the stuff back, all of this will end." And Damien said that the way he said it, it wasn't threatening. It was more like pleading, like, "Please, let's end this." Like this guy was tired of following Damien all around. Mm-hmm. Please just give the stuff back and all of this will end. Like that was the actual tone of it. Damien didn't have time to respond. The second guy comes in, grabs the other guy by the collar, kind of like drags him out as if this guy is like broken protocol or something. So Damien gets back in the van and he drives all the way to a place called Winona, Kansas, where there's about 102 people who live in Winona, Kansas. Mm-hmm. At one point, his van breaks down on the side of the road, and these two good old boys help him put gas back in the van. And I get a phone call out of the blue one night, and it's this guy with a southern accent, and he goes, "You know a guy named Damien?" And I go, "Yeah." And he goes, You Guffey? You Professor Guffey? And I go, yeah. And he goes, "Well, your friend says he's being followed, by all these invisible midgets, and there's these drones following him. Is that true?" And I go, "Yes, it is true." And then I proceed to tell him, like, everything I've just told you. And as I'm talking to him, and I'm trying to convince this guy that all of this is actually happening, they start remarking on the fact that there's this little light that's hovering outside, and they actually see the drone hover down near their house as I'm talking to them. So that convinced them, and then they gave him gas and they gave him some money so that he could continue on his journey. So he settled down in Winona, Kansas, because apparently if the town, for some reason, everything stopped when he got to Winona, Kansas. I don't know if they got tired of it or if it was because the town was so small they couldn't get away with the street theater stuff, because obviously if there's 102 people in the town, you would see like a parade of jarheads following the stranger down the middle of the street in a black van with bumper stickers on it that he created that said, gaslit and loving it, things like that he would throw on the van.
That's funny.
And by the way, this van is like not in any way surreptitious or covert. It's this black windowless van that the exhaust fumes comes up into the passenger seat, and it makes this sound, like a roller coaster, and it's not in any way covert. So there's if you saw like a bunch of vehicles like following this black van down the street, you would definitely notice it in Winona, Kansas. So he actually settled down there for a few months, and it all stopped for a while. And then when he was able to sort of rest and like get his bearings for a bit, he was scouring the internet, trying to find anything about this invisibility technology that he had seen or thought he had seen. And he was trying to find anything that might look like that. And he found some guy in Japan who had created this invisibility cloak, but that didn't quite look like what he had seen. And finally he came across this website, Chameleo.net, that was run by this guy named Richard Schoengert. And Damien sends me the link to it and says, check this out, because this kind of like sounds like what I saw. So I'm looking at the website, and by the way, synchronicity like plays a big role in this story. I'm looking at Richard Schoengert's website, and I'm reading the description of this cloaking technology that he claims to have invented. And I noticed that he's local. He lives in Costa Mesa. And it says that he has, top secret clearance. He works for Northrop Grumman, but that this Project Chameleo, as he calls it, is a private, side venture of his own. And he also mentions that he's a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason with the Scottish Rite in Long Beach, which was funny because at the time I was a 32nd degree Freemason in the Scottish Rite in Long Beach, the same lodge. So I realized I must have met this guy, or I've seen him, but didn't know, I never interacted with him enough to know that he was, dabbling in cloaking technology. So I email Richard Schoengert and I say, would you mind if I interviewed you? And I think because I mentioned that I was in the same lodge, he was perfectly willing to meet with me. And I said, do you mind if I bring a friend along with me? So he said, sure. So Damien came all the way down from where he was living and stayed at my apartment. And I arranged to meet Richard at the local Scottish Rite on a Saturday morning. And after the rituals, when I met him, I realized I had seen him performing in some of the rituals of the Scottish Rite, but had never been formally introduced to him. And so he seems like, a nice gentleman, and we took him to lunch and then took him back to campus where I and Damien interviewed him for about 2 hours, a little bit more than that. And I didn't know exactly how this was going to go. I thought maybe this will tie in, maybe it won't. But everything he said, just every single point that Richard said just tied in with Damien's story. He mentions that SAIC, the corporation I previously mentioned that was located only about 10 minutes away from Damien's apartment, had visited Richard 10 years before to see his invisibility technology. And Richard even mentioned that he got the feeling they were kind of like vacuum cleaners who were coming in kind of draining his brain rather than interested in working with him. The Navy came out to the laboratory that he was working in with Dr. Lev Berger, who's an eminent physicist, whose laboratory is out in Hemet. I visited his laboratory. It's out in the middle of no man's land. And the Navy, so the NCI, the Navy had come, and SAIC had come to look at the technology. Richard just kind of briefly mentioned that he often wondered if the technology had been stolen. He mentioned that he actually had a lawsuit going in that regard. And then at a certain point, I even asked him, could this technology be used not just to cloak things, but to make other things appear? Could you make like a bizarre alien world appear outside someone's window? Oh, yes, that's in the patent. Yes, the psychological warfare aspects are in the original patent, he says. I say, do you think you could make a room appear to grow or to shrink? He said, oh, yeah, you could do that. Just each thing that I mentioned, he was, oh, yes, absolutely. And then he would explain exactly how you could do that. Then so finally I said, okay, my friend Damien has a story to tell you. So then Damien proceeds to tell him the story, everything I've told you. And at first Richard seemed a little skeptical, but then when Damien mentioned the bit about seeing the auras, that they looked like these little dots in the air, he leaned forward. Richard leaned forward and said, "That's exactly what the technology looks like when it's not operating properly." And then when Damien mentioned the moving the mirror in the medicine cabinet and being able to see them in the mirror, Richard said, he said that's exactly what would happen because you're essentially cloaking the individual but not the mirror. So those things that seemed to convince Richard that Damien wasn't just weaving some sort of tale, because those were obscure technological details that Damien could not make up, nor would I make that up. Right. And so Richard left the meeting just even more convinced that he had been stolen from. So then after that, Damien was sort of moving around a lot. I kind of lost touch with him at a certain point, and then eventually he moved to an area called the Lost Coast up north near Humboldt, and his mom lived in a house out in the middle in nowhere, and everything had kind of waned for a while, though there was a period there where he was living in San Francisco, and whenever there was a huge Occupy Wall Street protest or anything like that, if Damien went outside, they'd just be right on his ass immediately. He learned to stay indoors whenever there was a protest, political protest or anything like that. But then from San Francisco, he moved to Humboldt. And the second he moves there, the local marijuana farmers, of which there are many in that area, start telling Damien that they're seeing these weird drones flying overhead, and you might assume that that's probably due to the fact that they're marijuana farmers. But these guys were saying, we've never seen these things before until, you showed up. And in fact, one day, some of these marijuana farmers, these kind of hippie redneck marijuana farmers, grabbed their rifles and went outside and started shooting at these UFO drone things because they thought they were there to scope out their marijuana gardens. So at this point, things started to heat up again. He started experiencing the sort of metallic taste in his mouth again, and that kind of thing. So he left the Lost Coast area and moved to the Pacific Northwest. But it hasn't waned. It's gotten worse recently. I just talked to him last night, and there's various things that he's learned to do to deal with it. I mean, essentially, he will, as I said, try to flip the script on them. Try not to act the way that you would normally act. Try not to give in to fear. He was on a bus recently, and there were like half a dozen people doing these weird hand signals at him. And he, instead of getting nervous or flustered, he just smiles at them, laughs, puts the Walkman on, cranks up the music to just drown out, their chatter, and reads a book, just tries to ignore what they're doing. Right. And that's the thing that seems to annoy them the most. Recently he was in San Francisco, and there was a guy who he recognized as one of these gang stalkers, because he's gotten to the point where he can tell, who's one and who's not. And he could tell that this kid, either like a teenage kid or like early 20s, it was clearly his first time doing this. He was being kind of a little clumsy at it. And this kid had brought his girlfriend with him. So Damien just, instead of running away, he decided to go towards the wave. So he went up to the girlfriend and starts hitting on her. And the kid starts getting more and more nervous. And then until finally the kid's like trying to pull her away. And as they're leaving, Damien overhears the girl say to the guy, well, he didn't seem that bad. As if they had been told that he was bad, as if they had been told that something that, he's a terrorist, pedophile, whatever it is that they say that he is. So he's learned to do the counterintuitive thing, to do the opposite of what your reptile brain tells you to do.
Right. Yeah. What about a potential lawsuit against some of these people? I mean, he does have the names to some degree. Can he actually pursue some kind of a case against them, because we have physical bodies?
I it'd be really interesting to try something like that. As I remember talking to Richard Schoengert about this, because he was going to attempt to actually sue the military. But the problem is, suing the military is almost impossible, and particularly in Richard's case, where he was trying to prove a patent infringement. There was a guy who, the guy who invented the windshield wiper, his patent was infringed upon, and so he had to go to court and prove it. Well, it took it's 15 years, and we're just talking about a little mechanical thing that goes back and forth, not something complicated like a cloaking device. And the problem is that once you patent something, the military has every right to take any of those patents and use them for their own purposes, and they don't even have to tell you that they did that.
Right.
So what you're suggesting would be interesting to try. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out, at least to try it,
Right. Well, it's so much duress. I mean, and he's not the only one, but putting somebody through that kind of duress, that to me is huge, and it should be a lawsuit, and it should be illegal. And yet these people are getting away with these things, and yeah, you can take it, tongue in cheek and with humor, but at some point the body gets very fatigued due to the duress of that kind of a program.
Oh, absolutely. I got the sense early on, within the first few months of this, that they were kind of shocked that he was still alive. I think that they're sort of observing things from their godlike standpoint, looking at the rat running around in the maze, just incredulous that this guy is still alive. But John Rappaport, who's a wonderful, amazing journalist, and he wrote a book called AIDS Inc. and a lot of other books, The Secret Behind Secret Societies. He reviewed Chameleo, and there was one line in the review that I remember. He said the best thing that Damien had going for him was that he was kind of crazy to start out with, so they couldn't drive him crazy. And by crazy, I don't mean like clinically crazy. I just mean living a life that is off the grid of what is normally considered to be normal behavior. And he's definitely a true nonconformist, and I think that's helped him. I mean, the lawyer who came to meet me in my office, the guy from Minnesota, this guy was part of the top country clubs in Minnesota. He $1 million house on the lake, all of this, right? And you could tell that he was discombobulated by all this. I mean, he was trying to get a job, any job in, he has these degrees, that he couldn't get a job. Every time he'd go to a law firm, they would act like he was a scumbag, and they would say, there's no room for you here. And you could tell how this disturbed him. And I was telling Damien about this, and Damien said, food always tastes better when you haven't had it in a while. I mean, he's not in any way obsessed with material objects. So in terms of stripping those things from him, they really can't do that and affect him too much,
Right.
Whereas this guy, the guy who was the lawyer, he was floundering. He didn't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. Poor guy.
But everyone, and it's incredible that this guy, the lawyer, the interesting thing about him was he had successfully sued the St. Paul Police Department in a discrimination lawsuit for an African-American Muslim woman who had been discriminated against by the local police department. He actually proved it in court and made the newspapers and made the local police department look really bad. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that he wasn't sure about how all this started or what started it, but I think that was probably enough.
Well, yeah, that was it. I would suspect.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, or I'm sure you're aware of the case of Gloria Naylor, who wrote the book 1996. She's a famous author who wrote The Women of Brewster Place and Mama Day and all these amazing literary novels, and very well respected. And she was living on an island off the coast of, I believe, the coast of Maine. I'd have to verify that. And she happened to be living in a house next door to some guy with her brother in the NSA. She accidentally poisoned the guy's cat, or the cat got poisoned somehow. And the guy who lived next door got pissed off and contacted his brother in the NSA, and then that's when this all kicked off for her. And she wrote a whole book about it called 1996, which was not published by her normal publisher. a small press publisher published it because I guess her normal publisher thought she'd gone off the deep end. It's called 1996 because that's when all this began for her, and I think the book was published in about 2007. But what's interesting in both those cases, I mean, Gloria Naylor, very well-respected woman, well-respected author, this guy, this lawyer from Minnesota, both of these people are in the upper echelons of society, and Damien's on the lower end, in speaking in terms of, class, and yet there's no difference. There's no one who's safe from it.
Right.
If you pissed off the wrong person, that's it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And they'll track you forever. And of course, I mean, I've been through it, and I sent you a copy of my documentary, so I'm happy to communicate with you afterwards. But yeah, it's unfortunate that this is going on. And like I said, it's too bad that they can't be prosecuted because it should be illegal to do. Everybody has their problems, but you don't sit there and take it out on someone like that to that level. And I still wonder, I mean, you've never been targeted, though. It sounds like you've been okay as kind of a neutral energy to the whole scenario, right?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Well, first of all, you say it should be illegal. It is illegal. It already is illegal. It's completely unconstitutional. I mean, there's this wonderful thing called the separation of powers, right? Police officers can't be judges, nor they can be juries, and yet these people are being all of those things.
Right.
And I think it really has. Well, let's answer the other question first. You said, has any of this stuff happened to me? I don't think I've ever been targeted the way that Damien's been targeted. However, I do believe that I've been approached by people who've tried to pull information out of me because the weird, unique thing about Damien's case is that it started with the specific incident with this kid, Lee or Doyle, whatever his name was, who went AWOL, and they were obsessed with getting these goggles back. And we've always wondered why it was that they were so obsessed with these goggles, what was so special about them. We wondered, me and Damien and Richard Schoenger subsequently speculated about whether or not the goggles, wondered if it had anything to do with the invisibility technology. Like perhaps if you put on the goggles, you can see through the camouflage technology.
Oh, right. Well, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, I mean, it's possible.
It's very possible. And so... the fact that they wanted these things back so badly, it seemed as if there was a period there. Let's say I think this happened around 2005. Damien came to my apartment in Long Beach, and he said, I remember him saying to me, "Watch out for anyone who new who just shows up in your life." And
Robert, we're going to head for a break. Stay tuned. We'll get back to that in just a second here. We're listening to Ravenstar's Witching Hour. This is Solaris BlueRaven. My special guest is Robert Guffey.